Hey, Bryce, I'd like to talk to you about something else that we've kind of floated out there in the last day or so, and that's the idea of tribalism, especially in politics.
Yeah,
Although I will say tribalism, I feel like in 2022 is more prevalent just in society than it's ever been. You know, and for people who
absolutely.
let me define my version of tribalism so people know what we're talking about. It's that idea that if you're not 100% for me, then you're against me. You're my enemy. You know, like if I agree with 95% of what you think or say or do or are,
Mm.
then for that person, often, not always, often that means I am your enemy. There's this new idea that feels new to me, at least, that you have to be either all on board, and if you're not all on board, then get the fuck out of my way, sort of thing.
Yeah,
And we see it in politics as well, and this is why I'm kind of relating it to those, you know, those big headlines that Mr. Luxon has been making, because we see it really clearly in things like a Trumpian world. You know, the election was stolen from me. See, facts and figures and sense and all those things, and the courts don't count. It's the tribalism of
mm,
he said it, so we believe it, so it's truth. And that to me comes more down to tribalism that, oh, we're 100% on board with this
mm.
figure. And if you disagree with 5% of what he does, then you're a rhino. That would be the American version. But we're seeing it everywhere at the moment.
It is.
And
It's
yeah, so what are your thoughts around that in the political world at the moment?
yeah, no, that is a global phenomenon that we're seeing, but New Zealand typically hasn't really been so tribal in the last few decades, and we haven't really followed that American trend of political polarization until recently. And so political scientists generally talk about two different types of political polarization. One is a kind of a policy-based polarization, where if you think about the left-right spectrum, you might see, the groupings of people moving more out to the left and right. So more extremes, some more radical left ideas, some more radical right ideas. That's one form of polarization. And personally, I think that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with people getting more passionate, more radical, getting out of the mushy middle. But there's another type of polarization, which is a tribal one, which is really what you're talking about, where people only identify with their own side of the political spectrum and identify with that particular political party, and they view their opponents in quite derogatory,
Yeah.
nasty ways. And it's a kind of intolerant polarization, whereby, yes, you only really agree with your side in the same way that people can be nationalistic about their own country. My country, right or wrong. It's likewise my National Party, right or wrong, or my Green Party, right or wrong, and that your party can do no wrong. It doesn't make mistakes, and people that support the opposite party are the problem in society. And we are seeing that a lot more. We're generally seeing that New Zealand is divided a lot more. We are becoming a bit more angry, discontented, and blaming other people. And there's a bit of survey research to show that that's happening. And so I do think that's quite a worry. I do relate it a lot to what we've seen since COVID has developed. I mean, if you think back to that first year, Pat, when we had COVID and we beat it,
Yeah.
there was a lot of unity. Everyone kind of unified. They voted back the Labour Party in record numbers. 50% of New Zealand voted for the Ardern-led government, and people were genuinely thankful for how Labour had, and Ardern had got New Zealand through the crisis. Business was overwhelmingly supportive of the government, but then all that changed. We had subsequent waves of COVID. We had the government being perceived as not really handling COVID so well after that first year, whether it was in terms of the vaccine rollout or the border, protecting the border. And I think we also started to see a lot more people being hurt, I guess, maybe just by the economics of the situation. We started to see more inequality. The housing crisis got worse. And I just think all those things started to flow through to anger and discontent. And that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that when George and I were talking about it before we came on, we were talking about the absolutisms. Is that the word we
Yeah.
use, George? Being absolute.
Yeah.
There's the absolute. I remember I wrote a piece a long time ago, actually, like in the first decade, so probably 12, 15 years ago. And the heading of the piece was something like intelligent debate versus ideology. And the premise of the actual the piece that I wrote was there's no one who's arrogant enough to actually think. They might say this, but to actually think that their ideology can be right 100% of the time. Maybe that's different. That feels a bit different saying that in 2022, actually. Maybe there are. In that era, it felt like that no one's ever arrogant enough to say that they are correct 100% of the time, which means sometimes your ideology will be wrong. And maybe this, whatever we were talking about, this is the time where you're either wrong or maybe partially wrong, or that feels to be like what a balanced conversation or a balanced perspective would be. But it feels more absolute today
Yes.
than it
No,
did even 15
right.
years ago.
Yeah, things have become a bit less sophisticated and nuanced,
Yeah.
and it's all very black and white. And so, no, it's not good for debate, dialogue, and disagreement, because we should be able to, disagree with everyone, else, and have, these kind of political conflicts, but still see good in the other side, or be able to learn something from the other side. And when we get those absolutes, then it's kind of a lesser democracy, and it's a lesser sort of, participation and debate. So I think it's a very sad way that things are going at the moment.
I think the distinction you made before, Bryce, is important, because there's always been political antagonism, right? And
Yeah.
The left and the labor movement have always built themselves around a sort of class antagonism. But now it seems like a more sort of, I guess, in America, it's a sort of culture war,
Yeah.
or an identity based antagonism.
I agree with all that. And the words you use of a culture war, I think, are actually part of the explanation that increasingly we are having these big debates on cultural issues. And they seem to lend themselves, to me, more to the absolutes. So when you're having debates around old-fashioned kind of left-right issues of, say, taxation or housing or economic inequality, somehow there seems to be the possibility of left and right to kind of disagree but still be on the same page somehow, still have those debates. Whereas when you get onto a lot of culture war issues, that possibility is not really there. So you're debating, say, transgender issues, or lots of ethnicity issues, and there's kind of a moral purpose in it all, which doesn't sort of allow any sort of learning from each other. It seems to be, much more about absolutes, and it's about, I guess, condemning your opponent.
Speaking of transgender and those kind of social issues, we've got a delightful story coming up after we finish up with you, Bryce, about a Republican politician who was hoisted by her own petard around some opposition to drag queens, where perhaps in her earlier life she wasn't such an opposing person to it, but she's become tribal, and to be a politician in that world, she has to be absolutely absolute in her, I'll say hatred, you can say whatever word you want, towards them, even though we can show and demonstrate it's not what she believes. Last question for you, Bryce. It's kind of a bit of a tangent from that absolute idea, but what do you think about, and I'm thinking about politicians, for example, saying, the one that comes to mind is, government spending is responsible for inflation. Plainly false, right? But it's a headline that's going around at the moment. In fact, George and I have joked that if we're still doing this when there is a like an election debate, we might do a drinking game which has got all these sayings on it, like the squeezed middle and the top down, not saying tax breaks, they're saying whatever, inflation adjusted whatever, instead of saying tax breaks. And what about, and I'm thinking of the tribal and the absolutism and sort of almost the gish gallop a little bit, but when a political leader, only because we're talking politics with you, it could be anyone in the news, says something that's oversimplified and patently false, what's the responsibility of us in the media? What's the responsibility of the opposition? And what's the responsibility, for example, of the networks? Like, I'm getting really frustrated with various television shows that have these politicians on that say things that are very easy to correct, and they just sort of let it go. I'm wondering if you have any comments around when we see that.
I guess from my perspective, some of these things you're talking about might not be totally untrue. And so there might be a kernel of truth in what they say. So if you're thinking about the inflation one, yeah, I mean, government spending might have some element.
Yeah, for sure.
The politician might be portraying it that it's all about government spending, and therefore incorrect. But I guess what I'm saying is you can't always write these things off and say that they're wrong. And the only really way to correct these things, in my view, is to have more debate and to provide more information and different perspectives. So, yeah, I think when a politician says something like that, they should be, the network, the journalist should be getting an alternative view on it. And ultimately, the viewer, the reader decides what's real, because that's the best way to deal with it. But on that inflation issue, actually, I think the one that should be watching out for is, I guess, workers being blamed for that. I think we're likely to see in the next 6 months, 12 months, people saying it's wages going up that's causing inflation. We can't have wage increases, and blaming it on the cleaners and all the people on minimum wage. Oh, we can't have wage increases this year because we've got to keep interest rates down. Everyone ends up blaming it on the worker. So I think that would be unfortunate.
Well, coming up before the end of the hour, Bryce, we're actually having a bit of a deep dive into what is inflation and what causes inflation, based around the conversation on Bill Maher's show over the weekend, and some a clip that we played a couple of times from Michael Redder, the former Reserve Bank advisor as well, and what he says causes inflation. And his position is more, it's about the Reserve Bank, not necessarily anything to do with government spending. Yeah. I agree with you that obviously there is a part to play with spending, but it might be a minor part, as opposed to being sold by the opposition at the moment as the major part. That's kind of what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Agreed.
Hey, Bryce, it's been lovely to speak to you. It's been so nice to catch up again finally. Hopefully we can do this again at some stage, but really do appreciate you giving us some time live from Wellington, although it's the second best little city in Dunedin, in New Zealand, I should say. But I thank you for coming on board very much so, and it's very, very nice to see you again. So cheers for your time.
You too, Pat.